All right, good morning. So, we are going to finish up our conversation about public opinion polling today, and then I'm also going to talk to you about media. So, my hope is that this recording will just be maybe 45 minutes, maybe 50 minutes long. But this will get you all of the information that you need to get caught up for where we need to be on Monday, the 21st of October. So, if you remember from our conversation yesterday or on Monday, so yes, I am recording this on Tuesday, the 15th, we finished talking about the idea of measurement, right? Of sampling, of what sampling error looks like, and how we start to create good polls. We ask good questions, we ask people what they know, we ask them straightforward questions. So let's move on to talk about the types of polls. So the first type of poll that we encounter is national opinion polls. And these are the kinds of things that get reported all the time. If you're paying attention fairly deeply to the news over this past weekend, there was some brouhaha over a new Fox News poll that talked about people's opinion about impeachment. And there was arguments from the president that it wasn't true, and arguments among pollsters about it. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about national opinion polls. These are those big polls that are meant to represent the opinions of all 320 million of us. But there are a lot of campaign polls, too, that are linked explicitly toward not opinion in general or even just opinion about political issues, but they're linked to ideas about campaigns, who people are going to vote for, whether they're going to vote or not. And we have a series of those that we want to talk about. The first type of poll is what we call a benchmark poll. So what benchmark polling is about is basically where are candidates starting off? What's their name recognition? That's really the key feature of benchmark polls. And that's what you saw the Democratic presidential candidates doing early on, and they're still doing in states that are a little bit later in the primary cycle. So they've already done these benchmark polls for places like Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina. But for ones that are later on, they're trying to figure out what do they need to do if they want to make a difference in that state or want to win that state. Then we have what's called tracking polls. Now, tracking polls are largely used for campaigns, although they can be used for some other things. And we talked a little bit about that earlier in this section. But tracking polls are about looking at people's opinions, particularly their opinions of who they want to vote for over time. So this is the kind of thing where you ask a smaller number of people every day a similar set of questions. So if you're doing a national tracking poll, you might be talking to 500 people a day, and you do that over time, and then you can see how people's opinions and how their vote choice expectation change over time. Then there are exit polls, right? And some of you guys may be getting some experience in doing some exit polling or helping with the political science department's exit polling for the Kentucky gubernatorial race in about a month. But exit polls are what are done when you stand outside of a polling place and ask people who they voted for. Now, this is an interesting challenge when we think about it, right? Because there are lots and lots of people who no longer vote at their precinct on election day. In fact, there are several states out west, Oregon being one, and Colorado being at least one other, who do entirely mail-in voting. There is no such thing as a voting precinct where you go in to vote. And so that actually changes how we think about it, how we do exit polling. And then there are things that are not really polls, but they belong here because people call them push polls, and they sound like polls when you first start. This is usually one of those kind of robocall things where you pick up the phone and it says, hello, this is a call from, I don't know, Democracy Strategies, right? And we'd like to do a poll with you. And then you say yes. But then what they're doing is not asking you questions. They're giving you what are called leading questions. And what they're meant to do is to spread disinformation about a candidate. So it would be the kind of thing where you would hear somebody say, like, if I told you that candidate so-and-so had an illegitimate child back when he was in college, what would you think about that? Right? So the idea here is they're not necessarily legal, but they exist in kind of a gray area because it's usually hard to figure out who is actually behind a push poll. But the goal here is just to spread disinformation. It's not really to do any polling. It's not really to get any new information. So as you've seen before, right, we saw this lovely Dewey defeats Truman picture before, but there are some problems with polls, right? Not only do sometimes polls get it wrong, but there are other things that can happen or other things that make them somewhat problematic in terms of understanding public opinion or being used by decision makers. The first thing is that polls are just one snapshot in time of potentially shifting opinions, right? So the challenge is that frequently issues aren't polled very often. They're only polled when they become important, or they're polled as part of a much larger kind of survey project. But the challenge is that polls usually only reflect people's opinion at that moment when they were asked. Polls also tend to enhance the media's focus on the horse race portion of campaign. So not necessarily on the issues, right? Not necessarily on the problems that voters want candidates to help solve, but on who's ahead, right? This is the stuff we talked about on Monday. Where people's opinions are news, right? And people's intention to vote for one candidate or another is news. So that's another challenge with polls. And then, of course, is the whole notion of sampling error, right? I would venture to say that 75% of the American population, maybe more, don't understand that whole conversation we had on Monday about sampling error and how we use sampling error to judge the quality of a poll. So there's just a lot of what we call data illiteracy going on out there. And so polling can sometimes be a part of that. It can add actually to the noise as opposed to adding information about the public, about its opinions or about its views on politics. Then there's also just a lot of unscientific polls that give real scientific polls a bad name, right? So these are the kinds of polls that you see on the side of a web page when you go to it, right? So this is the do you like to have ketchup or mustard on your hamburger kind of polls, right? We see those enough that people think, oh, well, that must be what polling is about. And so they undervalue the information that you can get from real scientific polls. And push polls are part of that too, right? So if you get enough push polls, you just stop responding to polls altogether because you think that their only goal is to give you information that's not true. Also, we know that there is actually quite a bit of influence that comes about from the interviewer or just by being interviewed, right? So part of it happens with the difference in whether we're talking about a face-to-face interview, whether we're talking about on the phone, or whether we're talking about a robocall where you're actually talking to a computer, an AI, on the phone. And we know that people answer questions differently depending on who's interviewing them. So it's not systematic necessarily. We do know we get higher quality information from polls that are taken by real people, whether that's on the phone or in person. But there is influence. There's influence by the interviewer, and there's just influence by being asked a question, right? There are ways in which people's behavior changes just because they know they're being watched. And the same thing happens, or being observed, right? If they're being observed by a researcher, the same thing happens with polling, right? Your opinions may change simply because you have been asked a question about them. And then we have a real problem with high non-response rates. And this is a growing problem. And I get it, right? Like I screen my calls. I don't answer calls from numbers that I don't recognize, because they're almost always a scam call calling me about my credit card, right? And so what used to be, we could be fairly confident that we could get somewhere around 40% of people who, if we call them on the phone, that they'll respond, is now down in the teens. And so what that means is that polling, and good scientific polling, has become much more expensive because it takes many more calls, it takes many more man hours to get the information now than it did 10, 15, 20 years ago. So that's another problem with polling. So let's talk about the results of polling, or maybe sort of the what we know about public opinion in general based on the polling that has been done. So the first thing that we can talk about is, what do people know about politics? Well, not a whole lot. I mean, and that's really one of the challenges that we face across the board when we talk about politics in our system, right? So remember that the citizenship quiz that I had you guys take the very first day of class, many of you realized, oh wait, maybe I don't know quite as much about American government and American politics as I thought I did. And in general, we find through polling that Americans are on average fairly ignorant, and they don't care. They're apathetic about the fact that they don't know a whole lot. And interestingly, information age hasn't helped, right? So that was always the early arguments, right? Up until the internet usage became widespread, most of the time what political scientists thought was, well, people don't know a lot about politics, and so that's why they come across as uneducated or they don't care, right? But the issue now is that there's plenty of information available, and people still are ignorant and apathetic about politics. And so the question we have to ask ourselves as we evaluate our system from a democracy perspective is that missing knowledge vital, right? Can people still be good citizens and vote appropriately even if they don't know everything about how the system works? And that depends. There's actually it's an open question in the political science research. Some evidence suggests that people in general interpret political party identification cues correctly, and they're usually pretty able to identify whether they want to be a Republican or a Democrat. And so that helps. But there's very little sort of specific knowledge about things like what does it mean for policy that Republicans are in charge or Democrats are in charge? And the reality is this isn't going to change. So how do we deal with this? Well, one of the ways we deal with it is through some of the laws that have gotten passed about civics education, right? That's why you have to take government as a 12th grader in the state of Ohio, and that's true in most of the country. And in some states, for example, in Texas, the universities are required that every student has to have a semester of American government and a semester of Texas government as part of their degree program. But the challenge still remains that people aren't necessarily interested in that information, right? And they don't necessarily care. They don't feel like their vote, their attention, their focus on any particular issue actually makes a difference in what happens in politics. We also know that people's political ideology, so how they put political ideas and policy and issue positions together in their brain, it's very inconsistent. In fact, there are, depending on how you measure it, it's probably less than about 5% of the population can actually sort of articulate a coherent political ideology, conservative or liberal, and link that to the appropriate party. But of course, parties change, right? And what does it mean to be conservative and liberal changes over time? So it's not necessarily clear that that's vital information for people to be able to be good citizens. I think the bottom line question we have to ask ourselves is the public rational, and does that matter? In general, the answer is probably no. The public isn't rational, but it's not clear that that matters. One of the challenges that we have to talk about and we have to think about is, what's the appropriate standard by which we ought to judge the public, right? Do people in general do pretty well in making decisions for their own, household incomes and making jobs and education decisions for their children and things like that? Yeah, absolutely. But that kind of expertise, that kind of ability to make decisions doesn't necessarily transfer up to politics. And maybe it doesn't have to, right? As long as we are electing people who broadly represent our interests and our opinions, we're probably okay. But the bottom line is this remains an open question, and this comes up every election cycle, is whether the public actually knows enough to be able to vote. And we'll actually talk more about that when we talk about elections next week. One of the things that we can see is that there's a consistent set of attitudes about the American system. We know that our national pride tends to be higher than other countries, or at least the way it's reported in polls. So how we talk about America as Americans, we tend to have more national pride than other countries. But there is a sense of rising pessimism. There's a declining trust in government, and an average response of the country is moving in the wrong direction of around 80%, 86% from this data. But and that's true regardless of who is in charge, like what party is in charge over the last 10 to 15 years. That's been a pretty standard response, so that many people are fairly pessimistic about the country as a whole, not necessarily about their own individual prospects, but about the country as a whole. And so that's a really interesting juxtaposition as well. So one of the questions that we need to think about, here we go, public trust in government. You can see it has declined fairly dramatically over time and consistently. And it goes back up. You see the little back up, but that was the beginning of the Gulf War. But it continues down. And is around about 20% is what our average percentage of Americans, of people who fully trust the government. Part of the other things that we measure that are usually about the system in general are things like presidential approval ratings, right? So I don't have my approval ratings numbers. Presidential approval ratings are another good way for people to determine, or for political scientists to determine, how the public is feeling about the country as a whole, right? Because the president is the only the only office that we all elect together, we tend to invest the presidency with more meaning and more power, honestly, than it really has in the system. That conversation is being tested right now about what is the relationship of the power of the executive branch versus the power of Congress. But citizens tend to assume the presidency has more power than it actually does. And so presidential approval ratings tend to be a proxy for how people feel in general about the system. We also know that with things like the rise of the Tea Party, the conservative bend in Republican politics that is conservative in the sense of being anti-government has impacted people's general opinions about politics, the government, and our democratic system as a whole. So that leads us to the next question, which is, given all this information that we know about people's opinions and how they make decisions and the kinds of distrust and lack of information that people have, is it rational for us as individuals to participate, right? Is it rational for us to vote? The bottom line is no, probably not, right? Not in the context of how we've set up this conversation, because it's rare, or it's very unlikely that your individual vote will make a difference in any particular election that you are voting in. And yet people still vote, right? So what's happening? What do we know what's going on? And why do people participate in politics beyond voting? Well, we know that presidential turnout has sort of moved around. So we tend to lament the low level of presidential voter turnout, and it's even lower for other offices. But in reality, it's wandered around about 55 to 60% for the last 100 years. So we just that's pretty normal for us. Now, we can demonstrate that it is higher in other countries, but there are other things going on in those democracies, right? Because their parties work differently, and they mobilize voters differently. Or in places like Australia, there is mandatory voting. If you don't vote, you pay a fine. It's something like $200 if you don't vote in a national election. So in our system then, why do people participate? Well, turnout and vote choice are linked to the same kinds of issues, right? So think about it in these terms, right? We are talking about how opinions drive system trust, and then which then drives political participation. So we'll take a little detour and talk about media, but then we'll come back to talking about elections and turnout next week. So this is all part of the same conversation. So why do people why do people participate in politics? Well, first off, we know that it's based on age. The older you are, the more likely you are to turn out. And that actually points to one of the things that we're starting to understand about voting, and that voting is a habit, right? So it's less about this sort of rational calculation to say, oh, well, I'm going to vote because I think my vote will make a difference. No, it's more along the lines of, yeah, I vote. That's part of what I do. And so we know that people who are older have had more time to build that habit. So why do people participate? Well, the older they are, they're more likely to participate. It's also the case that people of higher incomes are much more likely to participate. And that has something to do, we think, in general with the combination of education and social class, but also people with higher income jobs are more likely to have more flexible jobs, which allow them to go and physically vote, or to do the things that jump through the hoops that you need to be registered. And to vote either on election day at your precinct or by some other means, either by absentee ballot or through the mail. We also know that race and ethnicity plays a role. Interestingly, whites and African Americans are fairly similar in terms of their turnout, but we do know that Asian Americans are actually much less likely to turn out in general, and those lower numbers also hold for Native Americans. Gender matters too. Women are much more likely to turn out to vote than men are. And women do tend to vote differently than men do. So there is definitely some sort of gender gap at play, which is at least to some degree linked to income and social class, because women on average, right, have lower income than men do. But there is it's just a different sort of level of habit is built apparently for women than for men. We also know that religion impacts people's decision to turn out to vote or not. And the most important thing is registration across the board. When you just look at people who are registered to vote, it ranges between 70 and 80% of people who are actually registered to vote turn out to vote. So we know that that's a really important piece of the puzzle when we're talking about people voting, is that registration is key. And most of the hoops that you have to jump through in order to vote happen at the registration stage. So now you can register in lots of places, right? You can register when you get your driver's license, all those kinds of things. But when I was younger, you had to actually try pretty hard to register. The first time that I registered to vote, when I turned 18, is I knew that I needed an absentee ballot because I wanted to vote at home, even though I was going to be in college. I had to go find the county board of elections to go in and register to vote, and then register to get my absentee ballot. Now I was motivated, right? I mean, as we all know, I was a weirdo political science junkie at that point, even then. But that was how it was. It was hard to do. It was hard to accomplish. It's become much easier, and even in some states, one state, North Dakota, has gotten rid of voter registration, and several other states have instituted same-day registration, so you can register the same day you vote. But the reality is that registration is an important barrier, and therefore it is the most important predictor of whether somebody turns out to vote. So you can see that these are voter registration rates by social group. Now this is from 2008 data. But you see all of these different kinds of demographic characteristics that I was talking about making an impact. Education, people with college degrees are much more likely to be registered to vote. Employment, right? So this is an interesting one, right? So employed people are likely to vote, and so are people who are not in the labor force. Well, who is that? That's retired people and some other groups as well, but that's primarily who it is. And they are likely to be registered to vote. So you can see, again, ethnic groups, whites and African Americans are are similar. Hispanic Americans and particularly Asian Americans are on the lower end. Now they cut the age off here, but the 65 plus is actually up around 80%. So we know that registration rates are higher because of age. Now, education plays a pretty significant role as well. Now, that's in general. Remember, we had that conversation when we talked about political information. But civic education plays a big role in people's willingness to turn out to vote and whether they see their vote as making a difference. So remember, I mentioned this, I started this conversation on Monday about people who, what we call political sophistication. So people who are both educated and interested in politics. We call them political sophisticates. And those are the people, it's about 20% of the population who almost always turn out to vote and actually seem to process political information differently than their non-sophisticated peers. Okay, so that is the end of the conversation about public opinion. So we're going to go on and we'll talk a little bit more about voter turnout and how we measure turnout when we talk about elections. But what I want to do now is I want to switch gears and have a conversation about the media. So the media in politics. When we ask ourselves, what do we mean when we say the media? Well, it's the kinds of things that you would expect, right? Newspapers, magazines, radio, TV, the internet and blogs and social media, right? So that's one of the interesting challenges to think about, right? So when we talk about old media, we mean newspapers, magazines, radio, and TV. And that's pretty much what the concept of old media covers. When we talk about new media, we're talking primarily about online media. So whether that is specifically things like online news sites, whether that's social media or other kinds of blogs or communication or information kinds of disseminating sites online. That's what we're talking about when we talk about new media. And in theory, you guys will have talked about some of this in your group discussions in class on Wednesday the 16th. So now we have to ask ourselves then, what is news, right? Because when we talk about the media and politics, yes, we do mean all of the media, right? So it matters what is happening on a particular show that lots of people are watching. It used to matter a lot, for example, the kinds of political messages that were happening on a show like Saturday Night Live. But now that people's media consumption has fragmented so much, it's less the case that there's just one of those kinds of messages. But we want to concentrate here on the idea of news as the thing that's impacting politics, because news is something specific, right, as opposed to sort of media in general. So what do we mean by news? Well, and yes, this definition is as straightforward as it sounds. News is new information about specific and timely events. Yeah, I mean, that's just the basic definition, but it's also, we can define news as that stuff that is reported or information that's reported by the media. But the thing is that we have to ask ourselves is, what is newsworthy, right? I mean, all of you guys have had stuff that pops up either in your social media feed or in some other kind of news website or program that you are using that you say, wait, why in the world are we talking about this, right? So we tend to think of news as anything that's reported by the media. But, I'm not super convinced that information that is reported about what the newest, I don't know, trying to think of what's been on my Facebook feed lately, what the newest nail trends are for fall. I mean, I guess that's news, but I'm not sure that it's actually newsworthy. It's certainly information that's reported by news media, but again, we need to continue to ask ourselves, what is newsworthy? And the decision about what to broadcast, and I mean that whether we're talking about TV or newspaper or any kind of new media, I mean, that's a key question to ask ourselves. What is this actual information newsworthy? So what are the functions of media then in our society, or what are the functions of the news media? Well, I mean, the primary function of media in general is in entertainment. But another function is, in fact, to report the news. Now, most people who consider themselves to be serious journalists, right? So these are people with journalism degrees and maybe who work for more traditional sort of news outlets, see the role of news, the role of news media as identifying public problems, right? So we think about one of the challenges, or one of the ways that we know that a democracy is healthy, is if they have a free and vigorous press, right? If there are people, journalists, paying attention to what's going on and writing news reports about corruption or any other kind of information about politics and policy that's happening in the government, we think of that as a robust democratic system. So in that sense, news media does, at least in a democratic system, exist to help identify public problems. Media also does a lot in terms of socialization, right? Like that's why we watched that Schoolhouse Rock video last week, right? It was a clear intent to socialize people into a way of thinking about the world, into a way of thinking about politics. Media, particularly news media, also tends to provide a political forum. This is particularly the case with what we call earned media. So earned media is when a candidate in particular, or a politician, someone who's already been elected, does something that makes news media want to report on them. So we call that earned media, which is different than purchased media, right? So purchased media is advertising. So what candidates want to do is to do enough stuff that makes journalists interested in covering them, as opposed to having to get their message out by having to purchase airtime. And this is actually leads us to one of the most important, challenging, and maybe influential functions of media, and that's making a profit. This, I would say that making a profit is probably the most important, I'm going to skip this for now, the most important bias that that news media outlets face, right? So, because there's a lot of conversation about this, right? Is news biased, right? And we know that the president spends a lot of time criticizing the mainstream media as being biased. So here's what we actually know about the journalism profession. We know that, yes, reporters do tend to be more liberal than the population. Part of that has to do with the fact that journalism in general is a professional job, meaning you are required to have, in most cases, at least a bachelor's degree, and in many cases, some form of post-secondary graduate degree. And we know that education does increase liberalism overall. But part of the thing that happens, or is the idea with this idea of professionalized journalism, is that they operate by a code of ethics, as do most professionalized careers. Everything from the city planners that I interviewed for a project last year all talk about sort of being bound by a code of ethics. Like political scientists have a code of ethics, and so do journalists. And part of that code of ethics is also an expectation of objectivity. But here's the thing. We also know, when we look at the owners of the news media outlets, and particularly the editors, right? So the people who are making decisions about what kinds of stories are going to be run and what are not, they're actually much more conservative, right? Plus, corporations are small c conservative because their goal is about making profit, right? Their goal is not about sort of exposing public problems. So owners tend to be conservative and Republican, and they cannot offend advertisers, right? Advertising seems to be the most important bias, particularly in those contexts where advertising matters, right? So when we're talking about broadcast TV, even to some degree, we're talking about cable news outlets and other kinds of internet sources whose entire profit stream comes from advertising, not from subscriptions. So that seems to be the bias that actually matters the most, that profit motive makes the biggest difference. And the other part of the other bias, which we talked about earlier in the week, is also linked to the money, right? Because we know that across the board, news media is losing money. And one of the realities of that is that they have fewer bodies, fewer actual journalists working in those news organizations. And so they tend to rely more on official sources simply because that's where they can get information quickly. So then we should ask ourselves then, is the news media independent? Well, advertising plays a gigantic role. So in some cases, it's not just about, what kind of reporting would advisors prefer, advertisers prefer or dislike. So this is less about saying oh, well, Procter & Gamble would like us to run more stories about conservative things. That's not what it is. It's that advertisers' goal is to make money off of the attention of people who are watching the news media. So what kinds of stories do they want? They want the kinds of stories that lots of people will pay attention to. So you guys have heard probably on the they say this a lot in movies, right, too, but this idea that in local news, at least, if it bleeds, it leads, right? So this is why, and you can see this, if you look at people who only tend to get their news from local television, from local newscasts, they tend to have a much different perception of what the crime rate is in their city than do people who get their news from multiple sources. Why? Because what's the first thing that shows up on every local news show at 11 o'clock at night, right? It's a murder, it's a shooting, it's some sort of violence. And in fact, that's what people pay attention to, right? Flashy things, shiny things, violent things, bloody things, right? And so that changes the nature of news in that it becomes more sensational. And so that's not really about being liberal or being conservative, but it is about heightening people's feelings of threat, right? So people who spend a lot of time watching news in all sorts of venues, whether we're talking about cable news or stuff from the internet or even broadcast, it tends to heighten their feelings of insecurity because what do they see all the time? They see violence and disagreement and protest, right? So this is one of the challenges to think about when we talk about media being independent. So what happens then? Well, in the earlier models, what would happen is that if you didn't want to be beholden to to advertisers, then you moved into subscription services. And that's where cable started, right? That was the whole idea behind cable for the most part, particularly channels like HBO, right, whose whole profit model changed from being, having to follow what advertisers wanted to being subscription services. Okay, so there are a series of media regulations that are important for understanding how media works in our system. So first of all, there are ownership rules, and media is regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, and they're tasked to prevent media from having monopolies. Now, think about the context of time here, right? So newspapers existed before the Constitution. And so, in fact, what we know is that newspapers have tended to be more free in general and have less kind of issues with the Federal Communications Commission in terms of ownership. Now, part of that is also because many other forms of media, even when we begin talking about things like radio and then television and the internet, right, they have public utility components, right, because we have to get our information, we get our TV, we get our internet through cables that are generally speaking owned by public utilities like phone companies. So this is why there has been a much closer scrutiny on broadcast media than there has been on newspapers. But that's the goal, is monopoly. So one of the things that people don't necessarily realize is that by federal communication regulation, the big national networks are only allowed to own 5 local stations. So most of the time what they do is they own the stations in the 5 biggest media markets, right? Because that's how they make the most money. All the other local stations, and Cincinnati's stations are included in that, are owned by other media companies, places like Scripps, or I forget some of the other names. But what they do is they're holding companies for these local local television stations. And that's how they get around these sort of monopoly rules that exist. So newspapers are much freer than TV. The only thing that really exists for them is prior restraint. We talked about that when we talked about freedom of the press. For television and for radio, there are these series of rules that have largely, it's not that they have gone, it's not that they've been repealed, it's that they have been made moot by the choices of many broadcast media stations. So this is called the equal time rule and the fairness doctrine. And what used to happen is that there used to be more, right, so television networks in particular, and sometimes radio networks, would invite candidates on to talk, right, to their, just to talk to their audiences, right, because they knew that more people would listen if there was someone who was running for office who was either on TV or on the radio. And what the Federal Communications said is, well, you can't do both, or you can't just have one candidate. If you invite one candidate, you have to invite both candidates. So, or you have to give the same amount of time, that's the equal time rule, to candidates. So what has largely happened is that TV, radio, broadcast media have moved to a full advertising model, which is basically they just say that this is the price for getting 30 seconds of airtime during this TV show. And that's true whether you're Procter & Gamble, whether you're, Bob's Used Cars, or whether you're a candidate for the Senate, right? It's always the same price. And that is seen as part of the fairness doctrine. So they don't discount for candidates. They just say, here's what this costs. Now, the one thing that's also listed in this is what's called the right of rebuttal. So if somebody, if a candidate gets on a show and says something that demeans their opponent, then the opponent is supposed to have the right of rebuttal. Usually how interview shows deal with this, right? Because plenty of political candidates end up right on interview shows, right? Whether we're talking about middle of the day interview shows, or we're talking about showing up on the Stephen Colbert show, right? Is that they invite both candidates and they just see who comes, and that's how they can say, well, we have offered this opportunity to both candidates. But it's very rare that you see any broadcast media being pursued by the Federal Communications Commission for these kinds of violations. Mostly it's set up into just a large regularized system where candidates are paying the same amount of money for advertising as everybody else is, and they are part of sort of the normal process of having people on talk shows. So let's talk briefly here. I think I'm going to talk for 5 more minutes and then I'm going to be done. And if I need to spend a little bit of time on this on Monday, I'll do it. But what's the role then of the news media in a democracy? Well, generally speaking, we think of the media in general as a government watchdog. And this has been true from the beginning, right? And this was true for democratic theorists back into the 17th century, right? The idea was that a free press is part of a check on government, right? It's outside of the government system, but that it is one of the things that keeps government from becoming tyrannical. And so the role of a news media in a democracy is partially government watchdog, but also it has an educative function. It's supposed to help clarify electoral choices and provide policy information for voters. Now, this is sort of a challenge when we think about it, right? Because another part of this very complicated picture of how media and politics interact is the fact that the whole notion of objective media is actually fairly new, right? All of those newspapers that we talked about at the time of the Revolution and the time of the Constitution, none of them were objective producers of the news. They all had a viewpoint, and they were all explicitly one party or the other. And has been the norm for our news up until the beginning of the 20th century, maybe even into the mid part of the 20th century, where you started to have more of this professionalization of the career of journalism and a stronger focus on public service and objectivity. So we know that a free press is necessary in a democracy, but we also know that, like any institution, right? And remember, an institution is a framework through which we do politics. That any institution has flaws, right? And does not live up to the democratic ideal, right? Voters don't live up to the democratic ideal. Our elected officials don't live up to the democratic ideal, and neither does media. And so, generally speaking, when we talk about the role of news media in democracy, for my money at least, the best plan is to be that idea from earlier English common law, right? That the more ideas that are out in the marketplace, the more able we are to get at the truth. And so having a free press, right, having a free news media and a free media in general means there's going to be a lot of noise and a lot of chaos. But I think I would rather have that than a more controlled system where you weren't necessarily going to be able to figure out whose side someone is on and what the goal and the expectation is of the people who are producing the news stories. So I think I'm going to end there for today. I will talk a little bit on Monday about media and government in the sense of the tools that government has to interact with the media. So we'll do that, and then we'll start on elections. And I hope you guys all have an excellent weekend. And please feel free to send me email if you have questions. Thanks.